What if I told you that something sitting quietly in the corner of almost every Catholic church, something most people ignore, rush past, or use without thinking, actually holds a power that most believers never fully understand and some forces actively fear? You've seen it, you've touched it, maybe you've even blessed yourself with it countless times, but what if the way you've been using holy water your entire life has been missing the point entirely? Because according to Father Dan Reehil, the real secret about holy water isn't just what it is, it's what it does when it's used with intention, and more importantly, what happens when it's not. Now, at first, that might sound like exaggeration, because to most people, holy water is just water. Maybe it's symbolic, maybe it's tradition, maybe it's just something you dip your fingers into out of habit before sitting down. But that assumption is exactly where the problem begins. Because when something sacred becomes routine, it loses its impact, not because the power disappears, but because the awareness does. And that's where things start to shift. Because Father Reehil makes one thing very clear. The spiritual world does not treat holy water casually, even if we do. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because if holy water is as powerful as the church teaches, then why do so many Catholics walk in and out of churches unchanged? Why do people bless themselves and still struggle with the same darkness, the same temptations, the same spiritual heaviness? It doesn't add up unless something crucial is being overlooked. And that's exactly where this hidden layer begins to reveal itself. Because the effectiveness of holy water isn't just in the object, it's in the cooperation between the visible and the invisible, the physical act and the spiritual intention. And this is where Father Reehil's story starts to take a deeper turn, because he doesn't speak about these things as theory. He speaks from experience that forced him to confront realities most people never even consider. See, before he became a priest, before he stepped into a life of faith, he lived a completely different life, chasing success, wealth, comfort, and yet feeling something was missing. And that emptiness wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. But he didn't understand that yet. Because when you don't recognize the spiritual dimension, you also don't recognize the tools meant to protect you within it. So when he eventually returned to the church after years away, everything began to change, but not all at once. Because conversion isn't a moment, it's a process. And in that process, he began to realize that the things he once overlooked, prayer, confession, the sacraments, and yes, even holy water, weren't small things at all. They were weapons. But not in the way people usually imagine. Not loud, not dramatic, not visible, but precise, intentional, and incredibly effective when used correctly. And that's where most people miss it. Because we expect power to look dramatic. We expect something obvious, something undeniable. But the reality is, the most powerful spiritual tools are often the simplest ones, which is exactly why they're underestimated. And holy water falls directly into that category, because while it appears ordinary, its purpose is anything but. It's been blessed, set apart, infused with prayer and authority, but here's the part most people don't realize. It's meant to be used, not just kept. So what happens when it's actually used the way it was intended? That's where things start to get unsettling. Because according to Father Reehil, holy water doesn't just symbolize cleansing, it enforces it. It pushes back against spiritual darkness in ways that aren't always visible but are very real. And this isn't just symbolic language. In his work, especially dealing with intense spiritual cases, holy water becomes something entirely different. Not optional, not decorative, necessary. But then that raises an even bigger question. If something this simple carries that kind of weight, then why hasn't it been emphasized more? Why do so many people go their entire lives without understanding it? And more importantly, who benefits from that ignorance? Because when something powerful is ignored, it doesn't become neutral, it becomes unused. And unused tools don't protect anyone. This is where the tension builds, because now it's not just about what holy water is, it's about what's been lost by not understanding it. And Father Reehil suggests that part of the spiritual struggle people face today isn't just because of external forces, but because they're walking into that battle unprepared without using what's already been given to them. And that changes everything, because now the issue isn't access, it's awareness. And just when you think that's the full picture, it goes even deeper, because there's a specific way holy water is meant to be used, a way that activates its purpose more fully, a way that most people have never been taught. And once you understand that difference, you can't unsee it, because suddenly something you've done 1,000 times without thinking becomes something entirely intentional, entirely powerful, and entirely different. But before we get into that, you have to understand why intention changes everything. Because without it, even the most powerful sacramental can become just another empty action. And that's exactly where the real secret begins, and why almost no one talks about it. Because here's the part that quietly changes everything. Intention isn't just a nice addition to spiritual actions. It's the difference between something being active or completely dormant. And that's exactly where most people unknowingly disconnect from the power of holy water. Because they perform the action, but they never engage the purpose. They dip their fingers, make the sign of the cross, and move on. But nothing inside them actually shifts. Nothing is consciously offered. Nothing is directed. And because of that, something that was meant to be spiritually forceful becomes, in their life, spiritually silent. But the moment intention enters the equation, everything starts to move differently. Because now, instead of a habit, it becomes a decision. Instead of a gesture, it becomes a declaration. And according to Father Dan Reehil, that declaration matters more than most people realize, because in the spiritual world, clarity has authority. When you bless yourself with holy water while consciously rejecting sin, consciously asking for protection, consciously inviting God's presence, you're no longer just going through emotion, you're stepping into alignment. And that alignment is exactly what darkness resists. Now, this is where it gets even more intense, because people often assume spiritual protection is automatic. They think, I'm baptized, I go to church sometimes, I'm fine. But that mindset creates a dangerous gap, because while grace is freely given, cooperation is still required. And holy water was never meant to be a passive symbol. It was meant to be actively used as a reminder of baptism, yes, but also as a weapon of purification, a line drawn between what belongs to God and what doesn't. And here's what most people never consider. Every time you use holy water with intention, you are renewing something. You are reminding yourself of who you belong to. You are reinforcing a boundary that the spiritual world recognizes immediately, even if you don't see it. But when you do it without intention, that boundary isn't reinforced, it's barely acknowledged. And over time, that lack of awareness starts to show, because the same struggles repeat, the same patterns continue, and nothing seems to break. But the moment you begin to use it differently, things begin to shift. Not always in loud, dramatic ways, but in subtle, undeniable ones. Temptations start to feel weaker. Certain environments feel different. There's a clarity that wasn't there before. And that's where Father Reehil's experience becomes impossible to ignore, because in situations where the spiritual battle is obvious, where darkness is not theoretical, but active holy water doesn't act like a symbol at all. It acts like a force. And that realization creates a kind of tension, because it forces a question most people don't want to ask. If something this simple has that kind of impact, then what else have we been underestimating? And more importantly, how much of our spiritual life has been reduced to routine instead of reality? Because once you see that gap, you can't go back to not seeing it. But then it gets even more specific, because there's a reason holy water is placed at the entrance of a church. It's not random, it's not decorative, it's intentional. You're meant to encounter it before anything else. Because before you enter into something sacred, you are meant to prepare yourself. And that preparation isn't just physical, it's spiritual. It's a moment to pause, to reset, to consciously step out of the world and into something higher. But if that moment is rushed, ignored, or treated casually, the preparation never actually happens. And that leads to something even deeper. Because if preparation is skipped, then participation becomes weaker. And if participation becomes weaker, then transformation becomes less likely. And suddenly, the entire experience of faith starts to feel less impactful, not because it is, but because the entry point was never fully engaged. And holy water was always meant to be part of that entry. So now the question isn't just what is holy water? It becomes, what have I been doing with it this whole time? And that question can be uncomfortable because it reveals how easy it is to overlook something meaningful when it becomes familiar. But that discomfort is also where awareness begins, because once you recognize the gap, you have the ability to change it. And just when it feels like you've uncovered the core of it, there's still another layer, because it's not only about how you use holy water in church, it's also about where else it belongs. Because if it's truly meant to protect, to cleanse, to push back against spiritual darkness, then limiting it to a quick gesture at the door suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. Which raises a question most people have never seriously considered. What happens when holy water leaves the church and enters your daily life? And more importantly, what happens when it doesn't? Here's where things get even more revealing. Most people never realize that holy water isn't just a one-time protection or a simple ritual. It's meant to be an ongoing, active tool in your spiritual life. Father, Dan Reehil emphasizes that the real power of holy water comes from consistent use applied with awareness and intention, not from occasional gestures or passive habit. Every time you make the sign of the cross with holy water, you are not just recalling baptism, you are making a spiritual statement, a claim over your life, your home, and your environment. You are inviting God's presence and pushing back against any negativity or dark influence that tries to enter. But here's the catch. Most people treat it like a casual symbol, a decoration, or a mere tradition. They sprinkle it on their forehead, cross themselves, and think that's enough, Father. Reehil warns that without conscious intention, holy water becomes like a switch that is turned off. It looks the part, but the spiritual effect is minimal. That's why so many people never notice a difference in their life, even when they use it daily. The key is the mindset, the focus, and the deliberate act of aligning your heart, mind, and spirit as you do it. Another point that often goes unnoticed is the importance of the environment where holy water is kept and used. It's not random. The church places holy water fonts at the entrance for a reason. It's the first line of defense, the threshold that separates the sacred from the ordinary. But Father Reehil points out that protection doesn't stop at the church door. Your home, your workspace, your personal spaces, these are all territories that can be fortified spiritually through the proper use of holy water. People often overlook this, but it's one of the most practical ways to maintain peace and safety in daily life. Father Reehil also stresses that holy water can have an effect even on the invisible spiritual forces around you. This is where it gets serious, because it's not just a symbolic gesture, it's recognized in the spiritual realm. When you consciously bless yourself, your family, and your environment, you're creating boundaries that darkness cannot easily cross. That doesn't mean life becomes perfect, but it does create a protective layer, a sense of spiritual clarity and strength that many people have never experienced. And there's one more subtle but powerful aspect, the combination of faith and holy water. Water alone is ordinary. Blessing alone is empty. But when faith is fully engaged, it transforms a simple physical substance into a conduit for divine protection and grace. Father. Reehil explains that this synergy, faith, intention, and holy water is what makes the difference between a routine action and a spiritual tool that truly works. Finally, he warns that ignoring these practices can leave a gap in spiritual defense. People often think I'm protected because I'm baptized, or I pray sometimes so I'm safe. But without actively claiming that protection through conscious, faithful use of tools like holy water, that defense is incomplete. The spiritual world notices patterns, awareness, and intention. When you engage properly, you not only safeguard yourself, but also strengthen your family, your home, and your spiritual life in ways most Catholics have never realized. Holy water, in its true power, is not passive. It is a weapon, a shield, and a constant reminder of God's presence and authority in your life. Part of the revelation here is that the ordinary gestures you've been performing for years are far more potent than you think, but only if you awaken to their full spiritual potential. This is why Father Reehil repeatedly emphasizes, don't just go through the motions. Engage, intend, believe. And use holy water as it was meant to be used, not as a habit, but as a conscious, deliberate act of spiritual protection and grace. The difference it can make is profound, subtle, yet undeniable. If you've ever wondered why some homes, families, or individuals seem spiritually strong and protected while others struggle, this may be the missing link. Holy water, when used with faith and intentionality, becomes not just a symbol of devotion, but a living, active defense that shapes spiritual reality. Once you understand this, it changes everything about how you approach not only holy water, but the entire spiritual life. And that's exactly what most Catholics have never been taught until now. The truth about holy water, as Father Dan Reehil explains, goes far beyond what most Catholics ever consider. What we think of as a simple ritual, a few drops on the forehead, a quick sign of the cross, is actually a deeply powerful spiritual tool. Holy water is far more than a symbolic gesture. It is an active instrument of divine grace and protection, capable of influencing both the seen and unseen realms. The difference lies in how it is used, with faith, intention, and awareness. When you understand this, holy water stops being just an accessory to faith and becomes a living spiritual weapon, a shield, and a channel through which God's presence actively works in your life. Father Reehil stresses that the common misconception is that holy water is primarily for tradition or decoration. People often treat it like a routine habit, something to do automatically without thinking because it's been part of their upbringing or cultural practice. They sprinkle it on themselves, bless their homes, and then go about their day expecting results to happen automatically. But this is where the vast majority of Catholics are missing the point. Holy water only works when it is combined with conscious intention. The water itself is blessed, but the blessing must meet the faith and awareness of the person using it. It's a partnership between God's power, the Church's blessing, and your spiritual participation. This partnership is what Father Reehil calls the activation principle. If you simply go through the motions, the holy water is like a dormant seed. It has potential but remains inactive. But when you actively intend to invoke God's protection, to shield yourself and your family from spiritual harm, and to purify your environment, that seed blossoms. It transforms into an ongoing spiritual defense. Every sprinkle, every sign of the cross, every blessing performed with faith becomes a barrier against negativity, evil influences, and subtle spiritual attacks that most people don't even realize are happening in their homes or workplaces. Father Reehil also points out the strategic role of holy water in daily life. Most people only think of it during Mass or in a church setting, but holy water is meant to be integrated into all aspects of life. The front door of your home is a critical entry point, both physically and spiritually. Sprinkling holy water, there is not just a symbolic act. It is establishing a spiritual boundary, an invisible line that dark forces cannot easily cross. The same applies to bedrooms, offices, cars, and any personal spaces where your life unfolds. Each time you sprinkle holy water intentionally in these places, you are claiming them for God, protecting your family, and creating a sacred environment where divine presence can flourish. One of the most overlooked elements is the personal engagement required. Father Reehil explains that holy water is effective only when you are mentally and spiritually present. That means thinking about what you are doing, believing in the power you are invoking, and consciously dedicating the action to God's glory and protection. This mental focus strengthens the spiritual impact exponentially. Without this intentionality, holy water can be treated as a ritualistic gesture with little actual effect. The difference between a powerful protective act and a meaningless motion lies entirely in the heart, mind, and faith of the user. Another critical aspect Father Reehil emphasizes is consistency. Holy water is not a one-time solution. Spiritual life is dynamic, and negative influences can try to reassert themselves if boundaries are not maintained. Regular use of holy water reinforces spiritual defenses and ensures ongoing protection. This includes daily blessings, personal use, and applying it at key moments when entering or leaving your home, before meals, or during times of personal struggle. Each act reaffirms your faith, your commitment to God, and your spiritual boundaries. Over time, this creates a fortified environment of grace, clarity, and peace that becomes tangible in everyday life. Father Reehil also unveils a dimension that many Catholics never consider. Holy water is not only protective, but also offensive in spiritual warfare, in the sense that faith and intention transform it into a weapon. Holy water can actively drive away negative spiritual forces. While prayer and sacraments are crucial, holy water is unique in its immediate, tangible connection to divine grace. By sprinkling holy water intentionally, you send a signal in the spiritual realm that the space is claimed for God, that darkness has no authority here, and that His will prevails. This is why it is so critical to use holy water consciously rather than habitually. Faith is the critical ingredient. Without it, the water is only water. With it, it becomes a conduit of divine protection. Father Reehil points out that skeptics and casual users often wonder why their homes or lives still face challenges, even when holy water is used. The answer lies in engagement. Faith without action is incomplete, and action without faith is ineffective. Holy water works best when paired with genuine belief, an active spiritual life, and intentional practice. This is the secret 99% of Catholics have never been taught, that the water itself is not magic. It is the faith behind it that unlocks its power. Another revelation he shares is that the timing of use matters. There are moments in the day or week when spiritual energy is stronger, such as during morning prayers, before leaving for work, or during times of spiritual focus when the blessing of holy water is more effective. These moments are opportunities to assert divine authority in the home, workplace, and personal life, creating a rhythm of protection and sanctification that aligns daily life with God's will. This intentionality, timing, and faith create layers of spiritual fortification that accumulate over time. Father Reehil also addresses the issue of family and community protection. Most people think personal prayer alone is sufficient, but he emphasizes that every family member benefits when holy water is used collectively and consistently. Sprinkling holy water over the house, saying a prayer together, and blessing family members is not just symbolic. It actively strengthens the spiritual foundation of the family unit. This creates harmony, protection, and resilience that extends beyond individual faith. It is a practical way to safeguard children, spouses, and even extended family against subtle spiritual influences that can disrupt peace, health, and prosperity. Perhaps the most powerful insight is that holy water can transform ordinary spaces into sacred spaces. Father Reehil explains that every room, every item, and every environment has a spiritual dimension. By intentionally blessing them with holy water, you are elevating them from ordinary to sacred, creating a space where God's presence is more accessible and negativity cannot linger. This transforms the home from a mere physical dwelling into a spiritual sanctuary, a place of ongoing grace, peace, and divine oversight. Finally, Father Reehil warns against complacency. Most Catholics have never been fully instructed on the power of holy water, and many treat it as a ritual rather than a tool. By awakening to its true purpose, used with faith, intention, consistency, and awareness, you gain not only protection, but also empowerment. You claim your home, your family, and your life for God in a way that darkness cannot easily challenge. This is the secret that has been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the faithful to recognize and activate its potential. In conclusion, holy water is not merely a symbolic act or a traditional custom. It is an active, powerful instrument of God's grace, protection, and authority. When used with faith, intentionality, and consistency, it becomes a spiritual weapon, a protective shield, and a sanctifying force in your life and home. It is one of the most practical yet overlooked tools in spiritual life, capable of transforming ordinary spaces into sacred places, fortifying families, and creating an ongoing layer of protection against negative spiritual forces. Father, Dan Reehil's revelation opens the eyes of Catholics everywhere to the true potential of holy water, a simple yet profound instrument that, when used properly, changes everything. Holy water is waiting not just as a tradition, but as a living conduit of divine grace. The only question is whether you will awaken to its power and begin using it as God intended, with faith, focus, and deliberate intention. The secret is no longer hidden, it has been revealed. The choice to activate it in your life is yours, and the effects can be life-changing, family-strengthening, and spiritually protective in ways that most Catholics have never imagined.